two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with John Monkovic, who is one of the organizers of Ithaca DSA's FreeCAT campaign, that campaign to make TCAT fare-free, but also a better system altogether. So John, maybe say a few words about yourself, who you are.
Sure. Yeah, so I am officially the community liaison is the name that was given to my role on this campaign. And this was really my first involvement with Ithaca DSA as an organization, roughly 6 or 7 months ago, is when I started. And yeah, it's been great to be a part of this campaign.
So today we're going to talk about how TCAT is funded and also how it might be funded. What is TCAT's funding structure?
Yeah, so there are a number of places where the funding comes from for an organization like TCAT. Roughly half of its operating budget comes from state and federal funding, um, and that is because TCAT is a kind of public service institution, just not close its doors to anyone. And in the case of the state funding, the amount of riders, the amount of miles driven by the bus factors into how much money they see in their budget. So that covers about half that state and federal funding. And beyond that, we have three different financial underwriters, local financial underwriters, who each provide roughly 6% of the TCAT budget. And so that's the city of Ithaca, Tompkins County, and Cornell University. And that has to do with the history of the system and the way in which three separate bus systems from each of those three institutions combined to form what we now know as Tompkins Consolidated Area Transit, TCAT. So those three local financial underwriters contribute 6% each to make up another 18%. Farebox revenue contributes another, some might say, measly 10%. And lastly, Cornell has its own agreement with TCAT, known as it's a memorandum of understanding, whereby Cornell essentially purchases free service for many of its students, mostly first years, and also staff who also get unlimited free TCAT service. So Cornell purchases in bulk all of those free rides, essentially, in one big package deal. And that comes out at about 20%, roughly in the 3 million figure mark total. And then, there's tiny bits and bobs that fill out the rest of the budget, which are insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And those pieces combine to form the entirety of TCAT's funding.
Okay, I mean, I've witnessed some of this. There are ads inside the buses. There are some ads outside the buses. I'm sure that's one of the funding sources. I have a certain insight into why Cornell funds those free rides. It doesn't want its beautiful campus turned into parking lots. So, for instance, a professor is urged to promise never to bring their car onto campus. And in return for that, they get the free bus pass. Wales, my husband, has done that very easily because we don't have a car. So, so it was quite easy to promise never to bring a non-existent car to campus.
Right.
And he is an enthusiastic bus rider. And I'm the one who usually says, yeah, but I can get there faster walking. So another question is whether, I mean, you've said Cornell has two parts of the funding. They have the free fares that they buy, the bulk fares, you might say, that they buy, and they have this part of the three-way agreement. But is that their fair share, would you say?
Well, it's certainly an interesting question, and on first glance, one might think that, oh wow, I mean, the 20% that they're paying to purchase those free fares, that's quite a bit, and they're also contributing the other chunk, and surely it must be Cornell paying its fair share. But when you look further into the numbers, it's really not the case. And a key statistic, which has kind of emerged in some local news coverage and that we've repeated a lot throughout our campaign now, is that 75% of all TCAT riders are Cornell students and staff, which is, I mean, quite a shocking figure when, again, you consider the fact that this is Tompkins Consolidated Area Transit, not Cornell Consolidated Area Transit. And when you consider the roughly 27% total that Cornell is contributing to the TCAT budget, and if you kind of do a quick crunch of the numbers, you'll find that Cornell's contribution is just over 50% of local funding. And in return, they receive 75% of all service, essentially. So not the most fair arrangement, one could say. And then there's other considerations to make, such as, I mean, when we speak about the idea of a fair share, you also have to look at the fact that Cornell is a institution with an annual operating budget of $5 billion. And when you compare that to the city of Ithaca's, annual operating budget, Tompkins County annual operating budget, which are, in the realm of, 70 million to 150 million, somewhere in that range, both of them. It's not really a fair comparison to say, oh, well, Cornell is contributing so much. Well, relative to the size of the financial pie that they have access to, it's a less impressive showing from them.
Yeah, could you just repeat what Cornell's annual budget is? I'm not sure that I quite caught it.
It is $5 billion annually.
Billion with a B as in boy.
Yes. Yeah,
oh boy.
Right.
I misheard to be honest, the first time you said it.
Yeah, it's quite a shocking
that's
number.
my okay. I mean, certainly I can see how the two routes that run most frequently are the number 10, which I think goes every 20 minutes or every 10 minutes, depending on the time of day, I think. And that's just between Cornell and, like, the shuttle between Cornell and downtown. And the number 30, which goes much of the time, every 15 minutes and goes through Cornell campus, connects Cornell with downtown and with the malls. So you can really see how And there just aren't any other buses to any other places that run with that kind of frequency.
Right.
And infrequent service to outlying places like Teaburg and Newfield and Lansing is a problem. We have sometimes wanted to go somewhere and realized that to attend maybe an event that would take, spend an hour there, we would have to go for half the day. So, what is the current state of the relationship between TCAT and Cornell?
Yeah, well, it's troubled to say the least. Um, and to kind of tie things back to the previous question, um, I mean, as you can see, from the disproportionate benefit that Cornell receives as compared to their financial contribution to TCAT, they have kind of manipulated, I would say, the organization, the public service that is TCAT, towards their own ends. And this is something I've heard from, in particular, members of the TCAT board who have been quite frustrated with what they see as bullying from Cornell. That Cornell has been increasingly pushing for this kind of perspective where they will only pay based on the private service that they are receiving, that them and their students and staff, their broader community are receiving. That they are not invested in TCAT as this, public utility for the greater good of the whole region. They are interested in getting a deal out of TCAT as a service, and that is the thinking behind the kind of bulk fare purchasing MOU that we discussed earlier. So I mean that's just kind of one angle to understand what kind of partner Cornell has been to TCAT. And in the past 2 years, there have been a number of really damning cases, some of which made kind of major news headlines in the local papers. In particular, Dan Klein, who was the former chair of the TCAT board, called attention to the fact that Cornell leveraged a significant discount of over $300,000 of contractually obligated funds that they were obligated to pay out to TCAT as part of contractual agreements. And this was during the pandemic in late 2021, I believe, that Cornell simply stopped sending the money that they owed TCAT as a way of kind of playing hardball and pressuring them into leveraging a discount, and that they did, unfortunately. And after several months of simply refusing to pay TCAT the money it was owed, they leveraged that discount of over $300,000. Now, you could argue that members of the TCAT board didn't fight aggressively enough against this, but this is, kind of a different matter. More recently, when the MOU agreement between Cornell and TCAT was set to expire and needed to be renegotiated, and this was this June, I believe. Of course, in a time of I don't know if it was record inflation, but quite a significant inflation, of course. And the MOU total was not adjusted to that inflation at all, despite some dissent from, in particular, again, Dan Klein on the TCAT board. And even more recent than that, there was a resolution brought by the TCAT board, and once again, Dan Klein, to initiate well, a plan to go fare free. That was the language of the resolution that was brought before the whole board is we resolve to initiate a plan to go fare free. And in discussions with the larger TCAT board, which of course has 3 Cornell representatives on the board of 9 total, those 3 Cornell representatives were instrumental in weakening that resolution into initiating a study into the logistics of fare free. And that study is now underway, even though one of these studies was already done not too long ago. So in the view of many members of our campaign, this is kind of a redundant stalling tactic, and one that once again Cornell representatives kind of had a major part in. So those are just a couple of the major incidents over the recent years that kind of demonstrate this bad faith partnership between Cornell and TCAT.
Well, there was also some dickering over, I mean, just recently, the whole 3-way agreement expired and had to be reinstated. And Cornell was asking for what looked like a way to back out of some of its payments.
Right.
I think, what happened then?
Well, from what I understand, the county wrote a letter unanimously, kind of rejecting this edit to the clause of the contract that Cornell was trying to push. And on the floor of City Council, there was also some, discussion and some pushback against it. And from what I understand, it did not go forward, although I would need to double check that.
Okay, and I suppose anyway, no matter what the agreement says, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what'll happen.
Right.
Well, I mean, the history, and I think you mentioned it, but I remember it. I mean, back in the 1980s, there were 3 bus systems here. There was the Cornell system, the Cornell buses. There was Ithaca Transit, and there was Tompkins Transit, or Tomtran. And it was around the middle 90s that there was this, I guess, consensus arrived at that the 3 systems would do better merged into one. I think it was rather confusing. People would try to hail a bus, and a Tomtran bus, and be told, no, you can't take it. It's because you're in the city or something like that. I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but and then there was a question of, well, would it be under the county or what? And somehow it wound up that they turned it into a not-for-profit, which I think, there had to be reasons to do it, but I think that makes it a little less responsible to the public. Although, I guess the city has 1/3 of the members on the board, and the county has 1/3 of the members on the board. So there is definitely a public voice there.
For sure.
Well, do you sometimes suspect that Cornell is trying to go back to that?
Well, that's something we've heard, especially in conversations with kind of local legislators who we have, been trying to urge to pay closer attention to this issue and kind of push harder on Cornell at the negotiation table in cases where they are directly involved with those negotiations. It's something we've heard is, oh, well, there's some fear here that Cornell might pull out. They've demonstrated themselves to be a bad faith partner, and we're scared that if we push them far enough, that they might pull the rug on us here. And it's an interesting hypothesis, especially considering the fact that there appears to be no evidence that this threat has ever actually been made by Cornell. So it's very possible that this is a bit of a imaginary threat that certain people in positions of power, perhaps are more interested in kind of playing defense against this imaginary threat than in playing offense against the actual threat, which is Cornell. That is just my own personal reading of the situation, and it's largely guesswork, of course. But I certainly get that impression. You mentioned some of the logistical reasons why merging would make a lot of sense, and of course, I wasn't around at the time to know all of these matters, but another very clear reason why it makes sense to merge is just the financials, and in the kind of written history of the merger, that is emphasized quite a bit, is the financial common sense of this decision. In particular, the sharing of a common facility for all of those three bus systems, right? They could all, instead of having three different facilities to kind of hold the buses in the operations, you now have one. And so, I mean, it's certainly fair to assume that if Cornell was to pull out, there would be significant overhead and administrative costs. There'd be, I mean, the transition itself would be incredibly costly. And then in addition to all this, it's unclear whether state and federal funding would come into play as it does with TCAT, because there is a difference there between a kind of public for everyone system and a kind of private just for our consumers system. And so it might be that they're not even eligible for some of those public funding sources, which would just put another dent and make a decision like that even more unwise financially.
Right. And of course, federal and state funding can always be based on income taxes, graduated taxes that, at least to some extent, are collected according to ability to pay, whereas city and county rely on property taxes that are extremely unfair. I mean, there, my pet example is, you might live in a very little house or apartment, and people who live in apartment, renters pay, they just don't write a separate check, but they pay the taxes through the rent. So you might live in a very little place, but then say you have one or two or three children, you need a bigger place. Now you have to pay more property taxes. Well, are there other potential funding sources?
Yeah, there are, and they have been exercised in other examples around the country where the fair free system has come to fruition. In particular, Corvallis, Oregon, is an example of where it was funded through local taxes. Um, and this is something that has been discussed internally by our campaign and from the start. And um, our view really is that we'd like to see a kind of progressive funding arrangement, of course, and that the ideal arrangement would, of course, be Cornell picking up the cost of implementing FreeCAT because Cornell can afford it, because that would be a very progressive funding solution, of course, because Cornell is escaping all kinds of property taxes and whatnot. And as I mentioned before, is like really disproportionately benefiting from TCAT service when you compare how much they're contributing to the budget. And so, yeah, I mean, this is an open question for sure, but we have our sights firmly set on Cornell as who we are looking to fund FreeCAT for sure.
Because that's where the money is.
Yes.
Well, thank you, John Monkovic. This has been interesting and informative. And I hope we'll hear more about TCAT and the FreeCAT campaign to make fares free to the riders and also to improve service and expand it. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.